Hello again. This lecture is about Shinto, one of the major religions in Japan. But Shinto is a rather unusual faith. Just as Confucianism has many of the characteristics of religion, such as ceremonies and a moral code, textual experts, ideas of self-cultivation and transcendence, without a great deal of emphasis on the gods or an afterlife, Shinto offers nearly the opposite. It's very much concerned with divinities and purification and the unseen world. Yet, as one mid-20th century source put it, Shinto, the way of the gods, has no official scriptures, no founder, and no organized teachings. Yet it is a powerful religious influence. The source that I just quoted was a 1948 report prepared by the General Headquarters for the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. That is, the occupation forces in Japan after World War II. We'll talk later about why the Allies took such an interest in Shinto. I'll give you a hint now. It had something to do with emperor worship. But here, I'll simply note that it wasn't the first time that Japanese governing authorities had stepped in to define a religion. If Shinto has no official scriptures, then what's it doing in a course on sacred texts? We will once again need to adjust our definitions and expectations a little. But it's actually fairly common for anthologies of world scripture to include selections from early Shinto writings. Shinto is a native Japanese religion concerned with harmonizing the human and the natural worlds and regulating relationships with kami. Kami are local divinities that are powerful, but not necessarily perfect or even immortal. Although generally unseen, the kami inhabit this world and can send blessings or cause misfortunes. Kami is also a term that describes the numinous power found in natural phenomena, such as mountains and seas, or rocks and trees, earthquakes and storms, and even in extraordinary animals and humans. It's said that a tree, a particularly old tree, may have a lot of kami, let's say. Rather than a set of doctrines, Shinto is more of a collection of rituals by which people pay homage to the kami, or they purify themselves from ritual pollution, often having to do with contact with the dead. Or they might celebrate life stages, or express solidarity with their neighbors. Shinto is closely tied to the Japanese landscape, with thousands of local shrines. It's connected to Japanese history, and especially to the origins of the imperial family. And it's a part of many Japanese customs, from annual festivals to mundane events such as opening a business or breaking ground for a building. Many Japanese don't consider themselves religious, but still participate regularly in Shinto ceremonies. You don't have to believe anything in particular. Shinto is often thought to be simply an aspect of Japanese life. And because it's rather amorphous in its beliefs, it's long coexisted with Buddhism and with Confucianism. You can draw from all three traditions without any fear of contradiction or heresy. Although Shinto does not have scriptures in the way that we usually think of them, there are nevertheless respected ancient texts that are closely associated with Shinto myths, rituals, and sensibilities. The two most important are early histories of Japan, known as the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. These two books are the oldest books in Japan, and they have been continuously studied by people whom we might call Shinto or even other Japanese. They're not used in worship, and they don't provide a foundation for a prescribed set of doctrines or a moral code. Shinto doesn't really operate along those lines. But the narratives that those two books contain can tell us something about the values and concerns of Shinto, particularly in their first chapters, which include myths of origins. In the 7th and the 8th centuries of the Common Era, Japan received an influx of cultural innovations from China, coming initially via Korea. Educated Japanese learned Chinese and were exposed to Chinese statecraft, literature, and philosophy. Buddhism came from China to Japan at about the same time. It also came through Korea. And the first writing system for the Japanese language was also developed in that period, based on Chinese characters. That actually wasn't a particularly natural fit. Chinese and Japanese belonged to two entirely different language families. So it would make about as much sense to use Chinese characters to write English, with some characters being borrowed for their sounds, perhaps, and others for their meanings. As with many peoples, the Japanese had myths and legends that had been transmitted orally for many generations, but in the 8th century of the Common Era, these were first written down by government officials into two books that we've mentioned so far. And the first that we'll talk about is the Kojiki. The Kojiki, it means records of ancient matters, dates to 712 CE. It was composed orally in Japanese and then was transcribed into an idiosyncratic writing system that uses Chinese characters both phonetically and semantically. So this system of writing was actually kind of made up for this text. So it's a pretty unique system of writing. The second text, the Nihon Shoki, or Chronicles of Japan, is sometimes known in the West as the Nihongi, and it appeared 8 years later in 720. It's longer, more systematic, and it was written in the classical Chinese language. The Kojiki seems to record a more distinctly Japanese version of events, but even so, it clearly shows the influence of Chinese thought and models of historical writing. Chinese concepts such as yin and yang show up throughout, as well as a focus on the court and its officials. It's very difficult to know what Japanese religion might have looked like before the arrival of Chinese culture to the Japanese islands. The Kojiki is divided into 3 parts. The first tells of divinities and mythical origins, and then the next 2 record genealogical details and anecdotes of emperors from legendary times until the death of Empress Sueko in 628 of the Common Era. The text of the Kojiki begins with a number of deities coming into existence, including the male Izanagi, he who invites, and the female Izanami, she who invites. And those two, Izanagi and Izanami, were married to each other. And then the story goes like this. All the heavenly deities commanded the 2 deities, Izanagi and Izanami, ordering them to make, consolidate, and give birth to the drifting land. Granting to them a heavenly jeweled spear, they thus deigned to charge them. So the 2 deities, standing upon the floating bridge of heaven, pushed down the jeweled spear and stirred with it, whereupon, when they'd stirred the brine till it went curdle, curdle, and drew the spear up, the brine that dripped from the end of the spear was piled up and became an island. This was the first island of Japan. The gods and goddesses agreed to produce children through sexual intercourse, but first they walked around a heavenly pillar in opposite directions, after which Izanami said, "What a fine young man." And Izanagi, coming around the other side, said, "What a fine young woman." And then they realized that it wasn't proper for the woman to speak first, but they went ahead, and their first child was born malformed. Then they went around the pillar again, with Izanagi speaking first, the male speaking first, and their subsequent children, the 14 islands of Japan, were all lovely. They kept having children, some 35 deities in all. So these are kami, deities of oceans and rivers and mountains and winds and trees, etc., until Izanami died in childbirth, trying to deliver the fire god. You can imagine how dangerous that delivery might have been. Izanagi, the husband, went to the underworld looking for his wife, Izanami, and he found her in the dark. But she had already eaten some of the food there and could not return with him. It sounds a little bit like the Greek myth of Persephone. Going to consult with the lords of the underworld, she told her husband not to look at her. But when he couldn't resist and produce some light, he saw her corpse wriggling with maggots. Terrified at the sight, he ran away and then cleansed himself at a river. When he washed his left eye, the sun goddess Amaterasu was born. The moon god appeared when he washed his right eye, and then cleaning his nose, there came Susanoo, a valiant male kami. Amaterasu, the sun goddess, eventually became the ancestor of the Yamato clan, the ruling house of Japan. The stories go on from the Kojiki. Susanoo was a wild and mischievous child, and when Amaterasu was disgusted by her brother's actions, she hid herself in a cave, after which the world was darkened, since she was the sun goddess. The other kami, trying to lure her out, gathered outside the cave and hung a mirror and a curved jewel from a tree. One of the goddesses did a spirit-possessed dance, exposing her breasts and genitals. The other deities laughed, and when Amaterasu heard that laughing and then peeked out to see what was going on, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, which they had hung up in the tree, and then that drew her out even further until she was caught by the gods, and then light again filled the earth. The stories of the human emperors that follow are rather tame in comparison, though it's significant that the grandson of Amaterasu presented the first emperor of Japan, was also her descendant, with 3 sacred objects: the curved jewel and the mirror that were in the tree, along with a sword that Susanoo had given to his sister as a token of his apology. Susanoo had found that sword in the body of a giant 8-headed serpent that he had killed. Although they're not open to public view, the ancient sacred regalia of a jewel, a mirror, and a sword are still used in the enthronement ceremonies of Japanese emperors today. These are perhaps strange tales, but in them we can see some of the characteristic concerns of Shinto. They're concerned with kami and with the natural world, with life and death and reproduction, with proper order and gender relations and purification rituals, and the divine origins of both the Japanese islands and also the Japanese royal family. Because the odd, unique writing system of the Kojiki is so difficult to decipher, it was not read much until the 18th century, especially since the Nihon Shoki, that's the second of those early histories, was written in relatively clear classical Chinese. So lots of people could read that fairly easily, and that text related many of the same stories as in the Kojiki, often in more detail and with some variance as well. The Nihon Shoki, completed in 720 of the Common Era, has 30 chapters, the first 2 of which recount the age of the gods. That is, the sort of mythical stories that I've just been telling. The next 28 chapters offer stories of the Japanese emperors, from the legendary Jimmu, said to have lived in the 7th century BCE, to more historical times, starting in about the 6th century CE, when Japanese civilization as we know it kind of gets started, to the reign of Empress Jito, which ended in 697. So it covers a somewhat longer time period than the Kojiki, and it shows a great deal more Chinese influence. The Kojiki and the Nihongi were never particularly popular or well known among the masses, but they are the oldest Japanese books, so they're often mentioned with regard to Shinto. A better candidate for Shinto scripture, however, at least according to the scholar Joseph Kitagawa, is the Norito, preserved in a book called the Engi Shiki of 927. The Engi Shiki, it means the Institutes of the Engi era, is a collection of government regulations in 50 chapters. Most of the book deals with various offices and ministries charged with taxation, military affairs, justice, the treasury, the imperial household, and so forth. But the first 10 chapters cover Shinto matters, from festivals and rituals to rules for priests and shrines, with particular attention being given to the grand shrine at Ise, dedicated to Amaterasu, protected by the imperial family, and one of the holiest sites in Japan. The Ise shrine, with its unique wooden architecture, has been rebuilt every 20 years, according to the very precise directions of the Engi Shiki since the 7th century. So the last rebuilding of this grand shrine was completed in 2013. And if you go online, you can see videos on YouTube or elsewhere it's actually a long process that takes place over many years, but it finally has its culmination in 2013. And you have to go look at some of this, sort of this grand ritual and ceremony. The 9th and 10th chapters of the Engi Shiki provide a list of 3,132 kami and the names and locations of their shrines throughout Japan. You see, the government has been involved in regulating the religious affairs of Japan for a very long time, as it specifies, here's the gods that are worshipped, here's the places and the shrines, etc., in basically a government document. Now, the Norito, which is the part of this text that seemed the most like scripture, is found in chapter 8, and it consists of 27 ritual prayers. These include praises of the various kami, liturgies for various shrines and festivals, petitions for good harvests and the protection of the royal palace, exorcisms, and purification from the effects of such offenses as tampering with irrigation systems, emptying excrement in improper places, leprosy, incest, attacks of insects or birds, calamities from kami, etc. Now, notice that some of these are sins, but others are simply misfortunes or natural disasters. But in Shinto, sometimes the lines are sort of blurred. You need to do purification rituals for both sins and for natural disasters. Unlike the Kojiki and the Nihongi, the ritual prayers of the Norito were memorized by priests, and they were used regularly in worship in ways that are similar to the sacred texts of other religious traditions. To give just one example, here is the prayer that should be said on rebuilding the grand shrine at Ise. By the solemn command of the sovereign grandchild, I humbly speak in the solemn presence of the great sovereign deity. In accordance with ancient custom, the great shrine is built anew once in 20 years. The various articles of clothing of 54 types and the sacred treasures of 21 types are provided, and exorcism, purification, and cleansing are performed. So these words would be said in conjunction with that once every 20 years ceremony. As you'll recall from earlier lectures, Buddhism played a large role in Japanese history, and for the most part, Buddhism and Shinto coexisted fairly easily. For instance, Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples were often built side by side, with the idea being that kami would protect the Buddhist deities in the temples next door. And at times, the kami were even considered to be manifestations of Buddhas. Remember that bodhisattvas can take various forms and such. Buddhist monks and Shinto priests work closely together. And today, most Japanese who participate in Shinto ceremonies also take part in Buddhist rituals on occasion as well. One of the most interesting figures in the history of Shinto was a scholar named Motori Norinaga. He lives from 1730 to 1801, and he is one of Japan's greatest scholars. He's well known for his historical, literary, and linguistic analysis of the 11th century novel, The Tale of Genji, which is a marvelous novel. But the project that was closest to his heart was the investigation of the Kojiki, which had been neglected and disregarded for nearly 1,000 years. So Motori painstakingly deciphered the writing system and the grammar over the course of nearly 35 years of study, believing that the Kojiki was truer to an original Japanese version of religion than the Nihon Shoki, which had been substantially influenced by Chinese thought. Motori's multi-volume, heavily annotated translation of the Kojiki was one of the triumphs of the national studies movement, which sought to understand Japan's native culture, as opposed to the Confucianism and the Buddhism that had been imported from China and that had long been dominant in Japanese intellectual life. Even more strikingly, Motori combined a brilliant critical scholarly analysis of the text with an absolute faith in the kami and their powers. At a time when Westerners were struggling with the implications of academic approaches to the Bible, so this is roughly the era of the American Revolution, when there start to be skeptics and deists and such, Motori in Japan was himself trying to reconcile his strong commitment to rationality with his belief in the literal reality of the myths in the Kojiki. Well aware of the limitations of human reason, he argued that the Kojiki must contain revealed eternal truths because, he says, who would fabricate such shallow-sounding, incredible things? Remember those stories about Izanami and Izanagi? You might imagine the difficulty of believing in the early modern period that the sun actually is a goddess, namely Amaterasu. You can see the kind of dilemma that he's in. In later lectures, we'll see similar tensions between faith and reason in the scholarly analysis of the Bible. Motori was never quite successful in establishing the Kojiki as the sacred scriptural foundation for Shinto. But during the Meiji Restoration, there was an attempt to make Shinto, purged of Buddhist elements, the official religion of Japan. The Meiji Restoration began in 1868 in the aftermath of foreign incursions into a Japan that had sealed itself off from the outside world for 2 centuries. This opening up, which was pretty traumatic, began when a formidable contingent of the U.S. Navy sailed into the bay at Yokohama in 1853 under Commodore Matthew Perry. And he told the Japanese to open up to international trade or face dire consequences. Some of the mid-level samurai at the time wrested control of the nation from the shogun, who was ruling in Tokyo, and claiming to act on behalf of the emperor down in Kyoto, they embarked on one of the most rapid and successful programs of modernization in world history. In just a few years, they went from being basically a medieval culture, fighting with swords and spears, to being able to defeat a modern European navy. Actually, they defeated Russia in 1905. It was an astonishing move toward industrialization and modernization. These samurai were hoping that Shinto might offer the focus for a new national identity. So in 1868, Shinto was declared the sole basis of the government, and a powerful department of Shinto was established. Now, keep in mind that Shinto provided legitimacy for rule by the imperial family, since there has only been a single dynasty in all of Japanese history. The current emperor of Japan still traces his lineage back to Amaterasu. The contrast with China is pretty striking, where there are, a couple of dozen dynasties in China. What happens in Japan is there's always the imperial line, and they live in the court at Kyoto. They reign, but they don't always rule. And so the most powerful person in Japanese history will make himself, say, the shogun up in Tokyo and will run things, but there's still an imperial family. And so in Japan, when modernization, the opportunity or the need for modernization comes, those samurai say, we're going to support the emperor and rebel against the shogun, which offers them a locus, a place to put their loyalties and to claim nationalism. And Shintoism becomes part of that process. So a few years after this Meiji Restoration in 1868, they're restoring the emperor to power is the idea of this. The government took control of all Shinto shrines, and Shinto priests became state employees. There was a backlash, however, from Japanese Buddhists and from Christian missionaries who wanted a more secular government with guarantees of religious freedom for all. And eventually the government gave in. They backed off a bit. In 1882, there was a law that divided the religion into Shrine Shinto and Sect Shinto. Shrine Shinto encompassed tens of thousands of local shrines and could continue to be promoted and regulated by the state, because it was declared to be a non-religious expression of Japanese morality and patriotism. So this kind of local Shinto is the sort of thing you might see in, say, Mount Fuji, which is thought to be a mountain with a lot of kami there. And it's just part of what it means to be Japanese, to show respect and reverence for that mountain. Okay, that's Shrine Shinto. Sect Shinto, on the other hand, recognized some 13 new religious movements, including Tenrikyo, which we'll talk about in a moment. In the early 20th century, Shrine Shinto became entangled with ultranationalism and absolute loyalty to the emperor at a time of increasing militarism, and it was eventually seen as a factor in the lead-up to Japanese aggression in World War II. During the occupation, after the war, ties between the government and local shrines were severed, and on January 1st of 1946, Emperor Hirohito issued a proclamation declaring that despite his auspicious lineage that went back to the sun goddess Amaterasu, he was not, in fact, a living god. Since then, Shinto has been regarded as a benign, if somewhat unusual religion. It no longer is a focus for ultranationalism in Japan. Over the last 2 centuries, Japan has been the site of several impressive new religions. One of those, Soka Gakkai, is a lay Buddhist movement based on the Lotus Sutra and the teaching of the 13th century Japanese priest Nichiren, and it claims about 12 million followers around the world. A similar, more distinctive faith is Tenrikyo, which was one of the 13 pre-war denominations labeled as Sect Shinto. But the label actually doesn't work that well. Tenrikyo is quite different from Shinto. For one thing, Tenrikyo is monotheistic. and it has a strong tradition of canonized sacred texts. There are about 2 million adherents of Tenrikyo today. The religion was founded by a peasant woman named Nakayama Miki, who lived from 1798 to 1887. On October 26th of 1838, she summoned an exorcist to heal her husband and her son, who were ailing. The procedure required the services of a female spirit medium, and when that medium could not be found, Miki offered to take her place. Okay, followers of Tenrikyo usually refer to Nakayama Miki by her given name, Miki, so I'll do that as well in this lecture. Remember, in Japan, as well as in China, the family name, Nakayama, comes before the given name, Miki. As Miki went into a trance, she was possessed by Tenri Onomikoto, a deity who claimed to be the creator, the true and real kami, God the parent, and he requested that Miki be his living shrine and his spokesperson. For the next 50 years, Miki, and she's known to her followers as Oya-sama, the beloved parent, she continued to receive revelations from this divinity, and she taught them to her followers, many of whom had come to her for healing and for easy childbirth. She taught that we are all the children of God the parent, who wants us to live a joyous life. And that's a technical term in Tenrikyo, so it's often capitalized, joyous life, free from pain, illness, and conflict. This can be done by purifying our minds of the 8 mental dusts that should be swept away. So those 8 mental dusts are miserliness, covetousness, hatred, selfish love, enmity, anger, greed, and arrogance. So we should just sweep those away. According to Miki, our bodies are only borrowed things and are thus not entirely under our control. Our minds, however, are our own, and they can find the joyous life through spontaneous acts of service, as well as through performing the rituals that were revealed to Miki, including sacred music, dances, and songs. Tenrikyo recognizes 3 books of scripture, the first of which is the Ofudesaki. It means the tip of the writing brush. And that is comprised of 1,711 very short poems written by Miki from 1869 to 1882, with most written after 1874, when Miki was in her late 70s and early 80s. Because of persecution from the government, the collection of these sacred texts, of these hymns and poems, was held secretly by Tenrikyo leaders until 1928, when it was first published, though it was banned again during the war years. The second sacred text in Tenrikyo is the Mikagura Uta, or Songs for Service, which is 14 songs written by Miki from 1866 to 1882. These are used in regular worship ceremonies, along with prescribed hand motions, and it's actually quite graceful to watch. You should look at this on YouTube and watch people recite these or sing these songs and then do the motions that go with them. And finally, the third book of Tenrikyo scripture is called the Osashizu, the Divine Directions, which is made up of 7 volumes of nearly 20,000 revelations given by Miki's successor Izo Iburi from 1887 to 1907. And those are often answers to questions that come through, and the answers come through sort of divine revelation. The first 2 texts of these Tenrikyo scriptures, along with a few selections from the third, have been available in English since the 1970s. Just a couple of quotations. The song for the service begins this way. Sweep away all the evils. Remember the dust that you sweep away. Sweep away all the evils and save us, O God, our parent. And he answers, listen, for I never tell you anything wrong. In the manner of earth and heaven, I created man and wife, the dawn of human life. I, God the parent, reveal myself unto you and explain everything, and the whole world shall bloom. I hasten to save you all. Therefore, all souls of the world rejoice and be happy. In the tip of the writing brush, God the parent speaks through Nakayama Miki, and he claims priority over the Shinto gods, declaring, I drew forth Izanagi and Izanami and taught them the providence of how to begin human beings. Remember those stories from the Kojiki. And the god in Tenrikyo urges proper worship and kindness. But most of what comes through these texts is a message of love and joyful existence. So it says, looking all over the world and through all ages, I find no one who is evil. Among all humankind, there is no one who is evil. It's only a bit of dust stuck on. So remember the 8 mental dusts that were mentioned earlier. So there's miserliness, what do we say, covetousness, hatred, selfish love, enmity, anger, greed, and arrogance. But those are just sort of stuck on to beings who are originally pure and not evil. The text continues, hereafter, calm your minds and ponder. Make sure that you will not be remorseful later. Long have you wandered on your path until now. You must be very tired of it. Finally, this time, a trustworthy place of worship has begun to appear. Be convinced of it. What a lovely message of hope and comfort. It's no wonder that Tenrikyo is one of the few of the so-called new religions in Japan that has continued to flourish and even begun to spread abroad.